He was a man who built a life on the edge of nothing, seeking only the silence of the wind, but the world has a way of finding the men who wish to be left alone. When a bandit's bride spoke a challenge meant to save her life, he was drawn into a fight that wasn't his, for a future he never thought he'd have. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss a moment of this story. The wind was a constant sculptor in this high, lonely country, shaping the man as much as it did the rock and the sparse, twisted pines. Elias knew its language. He knew the whisper that promised a cold night and the howl that carried the scent of distant rain. For 5 years, it had been his only steady companion, and he asked for no other. His cabin was tucked into a crease of the foothills, a small, solid defiance against the vast emptiness of the plains that stretched to the east. It was made of timber he'd felled and hewn himself, the chinking between the logs a testament to patient, calloused hands. Inside, the world was reduced to essentials: a stone hearth, a narrow cot, a sturdy table, and the quiet gleam of well-oiled steel from the rifle that rested on pegs above the door. The lines etched around his eyes were carved by sun and vigilance, not joy. He moved with a deliberation that wasted no motion, whether he was splitting wood, checking his trap lines, or simply sitting on his porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. He was a man whittled down to his core, and that core was hard, silent, and watchful. The past was a country he'd left without a map, and he had no intention of ever finding his way back. Here, there was only the rhythm of the seasons and the simple, brutal logic of survival. It was enough. It had to be. He saw them first as a smudge of dust against the pale sky, a disturbance in the stillness he guarded so fiercely. A man on his own learned to read such signs with an instinct that bordered on prophecy. This was not the slow drift of a homesteader's wagon or the lone passage of a circuit preacher. This was hurried, careless movement. He took his spyglass from its leather case, a brass cool against his skin. He rested it on the porch rail and brought the world into focus. 4 riders. They were hard men, their posture slumped with a kind of lazy cruelty. Their horses were ridden rough. And then he saw the 5th horse, a pack animal by the look of it, and the figure tied to its saddle. A woman. Her head was bowed, her hands bound in front of her. Even at this distance, he could see the weary slump of her shoulders, a posture of endurance, not submission. He watched them make camp a mile or so down in the shallow basin, where a creek offered water and some cover. He watched the man who was clearly the leader, a big bearded man with a swagger that spoke of unearned confidence, shove the woman toward the fire. Elias lowered the spyglass, his jaw a tight line. This was not his concern. He had drawn his circle in the dirt, and the world and its troubles were meant to stay outside of it. He had paid a high price for his solitude, and he would not give it up for anyone. He turned to go back inside, to the familiar quiet of his cabin, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. His gaze was drawn back to the distant fire, a tiny spark of human misery in the deepening twilight. The wind picked up, carrying with it a coldness that had nothing to do with the coming night. The next day, Elias kept to his work, his movements precise and methodical, but his eyes strayed constantly toward the basin. He told himself it was just a hunter's caution, an awareness of new predators in his territory, but it was a thin lie. He watched as 2 of the men rode out, heading west, likely to scout or hunt. That left the leader, another man, and the woman in the camp. Around midday, he saw the leader, Silas, grab the woman by the arm. She stumbled but caught her balance, her chin rising in a gesture of defiance that was visible even from a mile away. Elias raised the spyglass again. He saw the man's mouth moving, his face a mask of sneering entitlement. The other bandit watched, a vacant grin on his face. The woman, Lena, stood her ground. Her voice was too distant to hear, but her posture spoke for her. Then Silas shoved her, and she fell hard near the fire. He loomed over her, and that's when the other man, emboldened, took a step forward, his eyes fixed on her. The stranger's intent was plain. Silas laughed, a silent, ugly motion in the spyglass's lens. He said something to the man, then gestured to Lena. It was then she spoke the words that would cross the mile of empty space and shatter Elias's solitude. He couldn't hear them, but he could read the shape of them on her lips, a clear, sharp movement. She looked directly at the stranger, her eyes blazing with a desperate, cold fire. Later, he would learn what she'd said. "You can look," she'd taunted, her voice a low, dangerous thing. "But you can't touch. Not unless you're my husband." She'd cast a venomous glance at Silas. It wasn't a tease. It was a blade. A challenge thrown into the dirt. Silas's laughter boomed, and he kicked dust at her. The other man looked from Silas to her, confused and then angry, his simple cruelty thwarted by a complexity he couldn't understand. In that moment, watching her turn their own rules of ownership and possession into a weapon against them, something in Elias shifted. This was not a victim begging for rescue. This was a fighter, armed with nothing but pride and a bitter wit, holding wolves at bay. He lowered the spyglass. His circle in the dirt was gone. He did not go in with guns blazing. That was a fool's game, a young man's mistake. He was neither. Instead, he waited for the rhythm of their day to reveal a weakness. It came in the late afternoon. The second man, the one who had approached Lena, took a bucket and headed for the creek, away from the direct line of sight of the camp. He moved with a lazy arrogance, his rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder. Elias was already in motion, a gray shadow moving through the scrub and rock, his steps making no more sound than a hawk's shadow passing over the ground. He circled wide, coming up behind the man at the creek's edge. The bandit was kneeling, filling the bucket, humming a tuneless, discordant song. He never heard Elias approach. One moment he was staring at his own reflection in the water. The next, the world went dark as the butt of Elias's rifle struck the base of his skull with economical force. There was a dull thud, and the man collapsed without a sound. Elias dragged him into the thicket, bound his hands and feet with a man's own belt and a length of rope from his saddle, and gagged him with a strip of his shirt. The man would wake up with a headache and a long walk back to wherever he came from, if he was lucky. One was down. Now for the leader. Silas was sitting by the fire, cleaning a pistol, his back to the west, his attention on his work. Lena was mending a tear in a saddle blanket, her movements small and tight, her face a carefully blank mask. Elias watched, his patience as vast and empty as the plains. He needed a distraction, a reason to draw Silas away from the woman. He found it in the bandit's own horses. He circled back around, moving low and slow until he was downwind of the small remuda. He pulled a small pouch from his pocket. Inside was a dried mixture of herbs, one of which was particularly irritating to a horse's nose. He tossed a pinch of it into the air. It was a subtle trick, but effective. One of the horses snorted, then another. They stamped their feet, tossing their heads, their agitation growing. Silas looked up, annoyed. He shouted something, likely a curse, and got to his feet. He handed his pistol to Lena, a gesture of careless ownership. "Watch the camp," he likely ordered, and strode toward the distressed animals, away from the fire, away from his prisoner. It was the opening Elias needed. He moved from his cover, his rifle held low. Lena saw him first. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with a sharp, sudden shock of recognition. He was not one of them. His face was hard, his eyes were clear, and his movements were filled with a purpose she hadn't seen in months. He put a single finger to his lips. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. Elias closed the distance to the camp in a dozen silent strides. He reached the fire as Silas was still trying to calm the horses, his back turned, Elias didn't hesitate. He gestured for Lena to move away, and she did, scrambling backward, clutching the pistol Silas had given her. Elias picked up Silas's rifle, which was leaning against a saddle. He checked the load with a flick of his wrist. He now had both a rifle and a hostage. He moved to the edge of the camp's clearing, positioning himself behind a rock outcropping that gave him a clear view of Silas and the path back. He waited. It didn't take long. Silas, having failed to calm the animals, turned back toward the camp, his face a thundercloud of irritation. "Woman, did you?" he started to shout, then stopped dead. The camp was not as he'd left it. His second man was gone. Lena was standing 20 feet away, a pistol held uncertainly in her hands. And a stranger was there, a tall, grim figure holding his own rifle. Looking for something? Elias's voice was low and calm, but it carried across the clearing with the clear, sharp crack of a breaking branch. Silas's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively going to the empty holster at his hip. He saw his other rifle in Elias's hand, and his face darkened further. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled. "Just a neighbor," Elias said. "You're on my land." It was a lie, but a useful one. "The woman comes with me," he added, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Silas threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "That's my wife. You ain't taking nothing." He took a step forward. "I wouldn't," Elias said, the rifle in his hands coming up just an inch. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. Lena, seeing her chance, began to back away toward Elias. Silas saw the movement, and his face contorted with rage. "You stay put," he bellowed at her. But for the first time, his command had no power. She kept moving, her eyes fixed on Elias, a silent question in them. Elias gave her a slight nod. "Come on." Silas made his choice. He lunged, not at Elias, but at Lena, figuring to use her as a shield. It was the move of a coward, and Elias had been waiting for it. He didn't fire to kill. He fired at the ground just in front of Silas's feet. The dirt exploded, stinging Silas's shins and making him flinch back. It was all the time Lena needed. She scrambled the last few feet and took cover behind the same rocks as Elias. "My other man?" Silas spat, his bravado cracking. "He's tied up," Elias said. "He'll live, which is more than I can say for you if you don't get on your horse and ride." For a long moment, Silas just stood there, his mind working, weighing his chances. He looked at the hard, unyielding face of the stranger, at the steady rifle, at the woman who was now beyond his reach. He was beaten. With a final curse, he turned, grabbed the reins of his horse, and hauled himself into the saddle. He galloped away without a backward glance, leaving the camp and the woman behind. Elias watched him go, his rifle steady, until he was just another smudge of dust on the horizon. Only then did he lower the weapon. He turned to the woman. She was still holding the pistol, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the nervous shifting of the remaining horses. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. Elias simply nodded. He took the pistol from her unresisting hands, his fingers brushing hers for a brief second. Her skin was cold. He gestured back the way he had come. "My cabin's this way. You'll be safe there." She looked from him to the empty plains where her captor had disappeared, then back to his unreadable face. She had traded one stranger for another, but this one, she sensed, was a different kind of man entirely. She pulled her warm shawl tighter around her shoulders and followed him into the fading light. The walk to the cabin was made in silence. Elias led the way, setting a steady pace, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He didn't look back, but he was acutely aware of the light, uneven footsteps behind him. He could feel her exhaustion and her fear radiating across the short distance between them. When they reached the small homestead, he held the door open for her. She hesitated on the threshold, her eyes quickly taking in the sparse, clean interior. It was the space of a man who owned little and wanted less. It was a shelter, not a home. Reassured by its austerity, she stepped inside, her shoulders slumping with a weariness that went bone deep. Elias followed her in and quietly shut the door, the solid thud of the bolts sliding home seeming to seal them off from the rest of the world. "There's stew on the hearth," he said, his voice sounding overloud in the small space. "And water in the bucket." He gestured with his chin, then moved to the far side of the room, deliberately giving her as much space as the single room would allow. He began cleaning his rifle, his movements economical and practiced. It was a familiar ritual, something to occupy his hands while his mind worked. He was breaking every rule he had set for himself. For 5 years, no one had crossed this threshold. Now, a woman sat at his table, a ghost of the world he'd fled. He could feel her watching him, her gaze as tangible as a touch. He didn't look up. He knew what she would see. A man who was more a part of the harsh landscape than of the human race. He heard her move, the soft scrape of the ladle against the iron pot. He heard the quiet sound of her eating, slow and deliberate, as if she were relearning a forgotten act. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the fire and the sound of the oiled rag sliding over the rifle's barrel. He had brought her here to keep her safe, but he had no idea what to do with her now. The thought was as foreign and unwelcome as her presence. When he was finished with the rifle, he set it back on its pegs. He turned to face her. She had finished the stew and sat with her hands wrapped around the warm bowl, her eyes downcast. Her hair was a dark, tangled mess, and a purple bruise was beginning to form on her cheekbone, a stark reminder of what he'd pulled her from. "You can have the cot," he said. "I'll take the floor." She looked up at him then, her eyes, a deep and guarded brown, meeting his for the first time. "I don't even know your name," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias. I'm Lena." She said the name as if claiming it back from someone who had tried to steal it. He gave a single curt nod in acknowledgement. He took a spare blanket from a wooden chest and laid it out near the hearth. He checked the door one last time, then settled down, his back against the wall, facing the entrance. It was a soldier's habit, one he'd never lost. He closed his eyes, but sleep was a distant shore. Across the room, he heard the soft rustle of her lying down on the cot. He listened to the sound of her breathing, shallow and tense at first, then slowly, as the warmth and safety of the cabin seeped into her, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. For the first time in 5 years, Elias was not alone, and the knowledge settled in his chest with the weight of a stone. The next morning, Elias rose before dawn, as was his custom. He moved silently, stoking the embers in the hearth and putting a pot of coffee on to boil. Lena was still asleep, one hand curled loosely by her face. In repose, the fear and tension had fallen away, revealing a younger woman than he'd first thought. He saw the faint lines of hardship around her mouth, but also a strength in the set of her jaw. He stepped outside into the crisp, cold air. The eastern sky was a pale, pearly gray. His eyes scanned the horizon, a methodical sweep from north to south. It was a habit, a constant assessment of his surroundings for any change, any threat. He saw nothing but the vast, indifferent landscape. The 2 other bandits who had ridden west yesterday were still out there. And Silas, humiliated and angry, was a threat that would not simply fade away. He was a man who would view Lena not as a person who had escaped, but as a possession that had been stolen. He would be back. When Elias came back inside, Lena was awake, sitting up on the cot and clutching the blanket around her. She watched him with the wary stillness of a deer that has scented a wolf. He poured 2 cups of coffee into tin mugs and placed one on the table for her. He didn't speak. He took his own mug and went to stand by the cabin's single window, resuming his watch. Lena eventually rose and took the coffee. She sipped it slowly, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the details she'd missed the night before. The neatly stacked firewood, the sparse but clean dishes, the worn but mended clothes hanging from a peg. Everything spoke of order and self-sufficiency. This was a man who knew how to survive on his own. "He'll come back for me," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. "I know," Elias replied, his gaze still fixed on the plains. "He thinks he owns me. Silas, he bought me from my father back east. Said he was a rancher." Her voice was devoid of emotion, as if she were recounting someone else's story. He wasn't. Elias said nothing. He had already pieced together most of the story. There was nothing he could say that would soften the hard edges of her reality. Words were useless currency here. Action was the only thing that had any value. "You should eat," he said, turning from the window. He took out a slab of bacon and a sack of flour. He began to prepare a simple breakfast, his movements efficient. Lena watched him for a moment, then stood up. She went to the water bucket, washed her face, and attempted to bring some order to her tangled hair with her fingers. Then she came to stand near the hearth. "I can do that," she said quietly, gesturing to the skillet. Elias looked at her, then stepped aside, handing her the knife. He watched as she began to slice the bacon, her hands surprisingly steady. They worked in silence, a strange, unspoken partnership forming in the small, warm space. He made the coffee. She cooked the meal. It was a simple domestic act, yet in the charged atmosphere of the cabin, it felt momentous, the first step in building something that was not yet defined. They were two strangers, bound by a shared threat, learning to move around each other in the quiet language of survival. In the days that followed, a fragile routine began to form, built on unspoken rules and shared tasks. Elias would rise early and scout the surrounding terrain, always returning by mid-morning. Lena would have coffee ready, and they would share a silent breakfast. During the day, he worked outside, reinforcing the corral, chopping a mountain of firewood, and mending the leather of his tack. He was a man who found purpose in labor, and now his work had a new, urgent focus: fortification. Lena, after a day of cautious observation from the doorway, began to claim her own space. She cleaned the cabin with a thoroughness that scrubbed away the last traces of its purely masculine existence. She found a small vegetable patch Elias had long neglected and began to tend it, her hands in the soil as if trying to reconnect with something solid and real. She mended his clothes, her stitches small and neat. She did not ask for permission. She simply saw a need and filled it. Their communication remained sparse. A nod, a gesture, a single word was often enough. "Wood's low. I'll fetch water. Rained last night." Yet, in these small exchanges, a deeper understanding was growing. He learned to read the tension in her shoulders, to know when the memories were pressing in on her. She learned to read the subtle shift in his eyes that meant he'd seen something on the plains, a sign of movement that worried him. One afternoon, he came back from his scouting and found her standing by the corral, watching him. He dismounted and began to unsaddle his horse without a word. "You should teach me," she said, her voice clear and firm. Elias stopped, turning to look at her. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot." He studied her face. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard resolve. She was not asking for a weapon to feel safe. She was asking for a tool to fight back. He had spent his life trying to put down his guns, to leave that part of himself behind. But the world had followed him here, and it had brought its violence with it. To deny her this would be to deny her a chance to survive. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Tomorrow," he said. And with that single word, the nature of their arrangement shifted. They were no longer just a protector and a survivor. They were becoming allies. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence felt different. It was not the tense silence of strangers, but the companionable quiet of two people who understood the gravity of their situation and were preparing to face it together. He was not just protecting her anymore. He was arming her. The lessons began the next morning. Elias chose a smaller rifle, one with less kick, but still plenty of stopping power. He took her to a clearing behind the cabin, where he had set up a line of tin cans on a fallen log. He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. His instructions were simple, direct, and patient. His hands would sometimes hover near hers, adjusting her grip or her stance, but he never touched her without a quiet word of warning first. He was respectful of her space, of the trauma she had endured. He understood that trust was a fragile thing, and he was careful not to break it. Lena was a quick study. She listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her first few shots were wide, the recoil jarring her. But she didn't flinch or complain. She simply squared her shoulders, took a breath, and tried again. By the end of the first day, she could reliably hit the largest can. By the end of the third, she could hit any of them. Elias watched her, a flicker of something akin to pride in his stoic expression. He saw the same fierce determination in her that he had seen that day at the bandits' camp. She was not just learning to shoot. She was reclaiming a piece of her own power. One afternoon, as she was reloading the rifle, she spoke without looking at him. "You were a soldier." It wasn't a question. "A long time ago," he answered, his voice quiet. "That life is over." "Is it?" she asked, finally turning to look at him. Her gaze was direct, seeing through the walls he had built around himself. "They're coming, Elias. Silas and the others. You know it, and I know it." He didn't deny it. He had found their tracks 2 days ago, a wide circle around his property. They were scouting, planning. They were taking their time, which was worse. It meant they weren't just going to ride in. They were going to be smart about it. "We'll be ready," he said. It was a promise. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. The lessons were over. Now there was only the waiting. Lena cleaned the rifle with a methodical care that mirrored his own. They were a team now, their separate pasts forged into a single sharp point of purpose. Later, as she lay on the cot and he took his place by the door, she spoke into the darkness. "Elias?" "Yes, thank you." He lay there for a long time after she had fallen asleep, the weight of her words settling over him. It had been years since anyone had thanked him for anything. He had sought a life of utter solitude, a life without connection or obligation. He had failed. In protecting her, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was missing, a reason to fight. The silence of the cabin no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a held breath. The waiting gnawed at the edges of their quiet routine. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a man. Elias spent his days on the high ground, his spyglass a permanent extension of his eye, watching, always watching. Lena kept the cabin, her hands busy with chores, but her ears were always listening for his return, for the sound of his steady footfall that meant another day of safety had been earned. One evening he returned later than usual, his face grim. He didn't need to say anything. Lena saw it in the hard set of his jaw. "How many?" she asked, her voice low. "3," he said. "The 2 that rode west, and Silas. They're camped 5 miles out, biding their time." He walked over to the hearth and held his cold hands out to the flames. For the first time since she'd arrived, he looked tired. Not just physically, but a deeper, soul-wearying fatigue. She came and stood beside him, not touching, but offering her presence as a quiet form of comfort. "What do we do?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if searching for an answer in the dancing flames. "We don't wait for them to choose the time," he said finally, turning to her. "We make them come when we're ready." He explained his plan. It was simple, brutal, and dangerous. He would make it look like he was leaving. He would ride out at dawn, heading east with a full pack, as if he were abandoning the cabin and her. They would see him go. They would assume the prize was now unguarded. They would get careless, and they would walk into a trap. Lena listened, her expression unreadable. "You're using me as bait," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "And I'll be right here with you. They won't get through that door." It was a terrible risk, one that placed her in the direct line of fire. He was asking her to trust him not just with her safety, but with her life. He expected her to argue, to be afraid. Instead, she gave a single firm nod. "All right," she said. "What do I need to do?" Her acceptance, her sheer, unbending courage, struck him silent. He had offered her a chance to be an ally, and she had taken it without hesitation. He looked at this woman, who had been brutalized and treated as property, now standing ready to face her tormentors, not as a victim, but as a warrior. That night they prepared. He barred the window, leaving only a narrow slit to shoot through. He showed her where to position herself, how to reload under pressure, when to shoot and when to hold her fire. They moved around each other with a fluid, unspoken understanding, their every action bent toward a single purpose. As he was about to lay his blanket by the door for the last time, he paused. He went to the small wooden chest at the foot of his cot and took something out. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He held it for a moment, then walked over and placed it on the small table beside her cot. He said nothing. He didn't need to. It was a piece of his past, a piece of himself, offered in the quiet darkness. It was an apology for the danger he was putting her in. It was a promise that he would not fail her. She looked from the small bird to his face, and in the dim firelight, she finally saw past the stoic protector. She saw the man and the ghosts he lived with. Dawn broke, cold and gray. Elias saddled his horse, loading the pack saddle with enough supplies for a week's journey. Every movement was deliberate, meant to be seen. He knew Silas, or one of his men, would be watching from the hills. He swung into the saddle, his rifle in its scabbard. He looked at the cabin door one last time. Behind it, Lena was waiting, rifle in hand. He had left her with a heavy revolver as well. She was as ready as he could make her. He turned his horse east and rode out at a steady pace, not looking back. He had to trust her. He had to trust himself. The first mile was the hardest. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to stay and guard the cabin directly. But he held his course. This was the only way. Silas was arrogant. He would see a lone man riding away and a helpless woman for the taking. He would get greedy and careless. Elias rode for 2 hours, until he was well over the horizon from the cabin. Then he dismounted, leading his horse into a deep, hidden arroyo. He tied the horse, grabbed his rifle, and began the long, circling journey back on foot, moving like a ghost through the landscape he knew so well. He moved with a speed and stealth that would have surprised the men hunting him. The sun was high in the sky when he reached the ridge overlooking his cabin. He settled into a cluster of rocks, his spyglass to his eye. He waited. The afternoon wore on. The sun beat down. The world was still. And then he saw them. 3 riders emerging from the hills to the north. They approached cautiously at first. Then, seeing no sign of life, they grew bolder. They rode directly toward the cabin. Silas was in the lead, a cruel smile on his face, visible even at this distance. They thought it was over. Elias laid the spyglass aside and picked up his rifle. He rested the barrel on the rock, the cold steel a familiar comfort. He sighted on the last rider in the line. He took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot echoed through the stillness. The last rider jerked in his saddle and toppled to the ground like a sack of grain. The other two, stunned, wheeled their horses around, searching for the source of the shot. Elias worked the bolt action, chambering another round. He fired again. The second man cried out, clutching his shoulder as his horse bolted. Silas, a look of pure fury and disbelief on his face, spurred his horse directly at the cabin, his pistol drawn. He was going for Lange. He thought the shooter was still on the ridge. He was wrong. As Silas galloped toward the cabin, the front door remained shut, a silent wooden face. He likely expected a woman cowering in fear. He raised his pistol, ready to kick the door in. But before he could reach it, a shot rang out, not from the ridge behind him, but from the narrow slit in the window shutter. The bullet tore through his thigh, and he cried out in pain and shock, nearly falling from his horse. The animal shied violently, confused and spooked. It was Lena. She had held her nerve, waiting for him to get close, just as Elias had told her. Another shot came from the ridge. Elias's bullet struck the ground near Silas's horse, further panicking the animal. It bucked hard, and this time Silas, wounded and off balance, was thrown from the saddle. He landed in the dirt with a heavy thud, his pistol flying from his grasp. He tried to crawl for it, his face a mask of primal fury. The cabin door swung open. Lena stood there, rifle in hand, its barrel still smoking. She didn't look afraid. Her face was calm, her eyes cold. She leveled the rifle at him. "It's over, Silas," she said, her voice steady. From the ridge, Elias watched, his own rifle trained on the wounded man. He could end it now, with one more shot. But this was not his fight to finish. It was hers. Silas stared up at the woman he had brutalized, seeing not a possession, but an executioner. He cursed her, a vile stream of filth. Lena didn't flinch. She just kept the rifle aimed at his chest. The second bandit, the one Elias had wounded in the shoulder, had managed to get his horse under control. He looked from his fallen leader to the cabin, then up to the ridge where the first shot had come from. He was caught in a crossfire. He made the only choice a man like him could. He wheeled his horse around and fled, galloping away as fast as the wounded animal could carry him. Now it was just Silas, lying wounded in the dirt, and Lena standing over him. Elias began to make his way down from the ridge, moving quickly. He reached the clearing as Lena was still holding Silas at gunpoint. The man was bleeding, his bravado gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading look. "Lena, please," he whimpered. She looked at him for a long, silent moment. Elias stopped a dozen feet away, his presence a silent support, but he did not interfere. This was her decision. With a final, decisive movement, she lowered the rifle. But she didn't offer him mercy. She simply turned her back on him and walked toward Elias, leaving him to his fate on hard, unforgiving ground. "It's done," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Elias looked at Silas, then back at her. He nodded. "It's done." Together, they walked back into the cabin, shutting the door on the man in the dirt and the life he represented. The aftermath was silent and heavy. Elias dealt with the body of the man he had shot, a grim, necessary task performed with the dispassionate efficiency of a soldier. He left Silas where he lay. The plains were vast, and the coyotes were always hungry. It was a harsh justice, but it was the justice of this land. When he returned to the cabin, Lena was sitting at the table, staring at her hands. The rifle was propped against the wall. She looked up as he entered, her eyes shadowed. Neither of them spoke of what had happened. There were no words for it. The violence had been a storm that had passed, leaving a strange, quiet calm in its wake. He washed his hands in the basin, the water turning a murky brown. He then went about the familiar evening chores, stoking the fire, fetching fresh water. His movements were a steady, grounding rhythm in the emotionally charged silence. Lena watched him, her gaze following his every move. The man who had been a stranger was now inextricably linked to her. They had faced death together and survived. A bond had been forged in gunpowder and blood, and it was stronger than any spoken promise. He made dinner, a simple meal of beans and jerky. He placed a plate in front of her. She looked at it, then up at him. For the first time, a small, fragile smile touched her lips. "I think," she said, her voice soft, "I'm tired of your cooking." Elias stopped, surprised. He looked at her, and a corresponding, almost imperceptible upturn of his own mouth was his reply. It was the closest either of them had come to laughter. The tension that had held them both in its grip for days finally began to recede, replaced by a profound shared exhaustion. They ate in a comfortable silence. The threat was gone. The waiting was over. Now a new, unspoken question hung in the air between them. What next? He was a man who wanted to be alone. She was a woman with nowhere to go. Their purpose for being together, mutual survival, was fulfilled. After the meal, he took his blanket to his usual spot by the door. She went to the cot. But before she lay down, she picked up the small wooden bird he had given her. She ran her thumb over its smooth surface. "You never told me about this," she said. Elias looked at the bird, then at the floor. "It was my daughter's," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "I lost them. My wife, my daughter. Fever. A long time ago." He had never spoken those words to another soul. The confession, stark and painful, hung in the quiet room. Lena clutched the bird tighter. She finally understood the source of his fierce, protective nature, the deep well of sorrow he kept hidden behind his silent exterior. She said nothing, but her eyes were filled with a deep, compassionate understanding. She placed the bird back on the table, a silent promise to guard its memory. They had both lost everything, and now, in this small cabin on the edge of nowhere, they had found something. And next morning, the world felt new. The air was cleaner, the sunlight brighter. The cloud of fear that had hung over the homestead had lifted. Elias stood on the porch, sipping his coffee, watching the sun rise. The horizon was empty. It was no longer a threat. It was a promise. Lena came to stand beside him, her own mug in her hands. They stood together, watching the day begin. "The other one," she said quietly. "The one who ran. Will he come back?" "No," Elias said with certainty. "Men like that are only brave in a pack. The pack is broken." He was right. The danger was truly over. They were safe. The silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with possibilities. "I suppose I should be moving on," Lena said, though her voice lacked conviction. She looked out at the vast, empty plains. "I have nowhere to go." Elias turned to look at her. He saw not a victim or a survivor, but a partner. He saw a woman of incredible strength and resilience. He saw a future he had never dared to imagine. He thought of the long, lonely years behind him and the prospect of more to come. The silence he had once craved now seemed like a poor substitute for the quiet companionship he had found with her. He gestured with his chin toward the neglected vegetable patch, toward the corral that needed a new rail, toward the endless horizon. "There's work to be done," he said. It was not a declaration of love. It was not a formal proposal. It was something far more real. It was an offer of a shared life, a shared future, built with their own two hands. It was a statement that this place, his shelter, could become their home. Lena looked from the land back to his face. She saw the truth in his eyes. He was not offering her protection anymore. He was offering her a partnership. She looked at the small cabin, at the rising sun, and she knew she was already home. A real smile, bright and genuine, lit up her face. "Well," she said, her voice light and full of hope, "I'd better get started then." She turned and walked toward the house, her step sure and purposeful. Elias watched her go, a feeling he couldn't name swelling in his chest. It felt like peace. He took one last look at the empty horizon, then turned and followed her inside, closing the door on his solitude for the last time.